Yesterday, we had the pleasure to listen to Heather from Estuary Edges, and she talked about the funding. Today, we have her colleague, Amy Pryor. She's going to be telling us about innovative ways of approaching NBS in coastal and estuarine cities. So perhaps this might challenge that notion of NBS is not always possible that some of you have said. So Amy has been working as a marine scientist an estuarine scientist, as she described herself, for over 20 years. And she has a wealth of experience within very complex environments. Her main role is working within the Thames estuary. So this is looking at London. So maybe it's getting the scale of nature-based solutions to a slightly different level than what we used to within our smaller coastal cities. So hopefully you'll find this really interesting. And I'll just pass on to Amy to tell you more about it. If you want to ask questions, just think of questions, and we'll be taking some at the end of her talk. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you very much, David. Yes, I'm less of a scientist these days, I have to say. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm Amy Pryor. I'm Technical Director at the Thames Estuary Partnership, and I also chair a national network called the Coastal Partnerships Network, which you're going to hear a little bit about today. But as David just said, I'm going to be talking about innovative ways of approaching nature-based solutions in coastal and estuarine cities. But the context really that I'm aiming for and the message I'm trying to get across is that, cities have been built essentially because they're on our major estuaries, because of that link to the global ocean and maritime industry. So we need to be taking more of a wholescape approach, really linking our cities and our peri-urban and our rural coastal areas more meaningfully. So you're going to hear a lot about that over the next few minutes. But I'm going to start off telling you a little bit about the Thames Estuary Partnership. We're a charity. We're hosted by University College London, and that really embeds us across research that comes to bear that's relevant around the Thames Estuary. And there really is pretty much nothing that you can't study, that you can't ask a question about, that has some relevance across our estuaries and our coasts. So it's a really rich, myriad research area covering across socio-economic issues as well as environmental issues. And the Thames Estuary Partnership was set up 22 years ago in recognition that estuaries such as the Thames really need a more integrated approach across the land and sea and across sectors to the management and sustainable development of the estuary over time. So 22 years ago, we were set up by the founding partners, the logos that you can see at the bottom there, and they were all the key stakeholders that have some kind of responsibility towards the Thames estuary. And over the years, we were recognised as being a safe, neutral, convening organisation, an organisation that you could trust to bring all those different sectors together and enable a cross-sectoral conversation, to really try and break down those silos between the ways that we all work and try and find a way forward that's beneficial as it can be to every single agenda, every interest, every sector, and across socioeconomics and environment. So no mean task there. And we do that in various different ways, which I'm not going to go into in this presentation. But we're also not alone. We were one of several coastal and estuary partnerships that were set up back in the mid to late 90s. And currently today, there is 55 coastal and estuary partnerships around the whole of the UK. And I chair the Coastal Partnerships Network, which was set up voluntarily back in 2006 in recognition that all of these small organisations are doing brilliant work on the ground, trusted by the local communities, the local sectors, the local regulatory authorities, to do that convening work, to create that safe space for conversation. And also, they make sure that projects, they can find ways forward and co-develop projects across sectors to fill a gap in knowledge or fill a gap in process and really accelerate local delivery and local impact on the ground. They're all very different. They all differ in size, in governance structure, in the focus of what they actually focus on in terms of work delivery. And that's really a reflection of the funding, where the funding comes from. So and they also, with their governance structures differing so much, they can be everything from a registered charity like ourselves down to a project within a university. So it really shows, I think, the strength in that difference, because they've grown locally and sort of organically, if you like, over time, from that community-led need to have that space for the connections and the conversations. But they've managed to survive over time by diversifying how they find money, what they focus on, and really, managing to stay alive, basically, over 30 years of austerity coming and going and changes in legislation. So really, that to me speaks of the power of the partnership model, that everybody needs it, everybody wants it, but it is extremely difficult to fund. And this is basically what a coastal and estuary partnership does. We can harmonise those funding streams from across private, public and civic society. We do the connection with the catchment management upstream, inland, that vertical integration across the land and sea interface. And we do the horizontal integration across either along an estuarine riverside or across a coastal space. We do a huge amount of communications, really aligning messages and getting information out there across all the different sectors into the public. And we can really make it land. We can do that local impact and delivery. So coming back to the Thames estuary, this is my stomping grounds. The Thames is 95 miles long. The tidal reaches is in Teddington in West London near Hampton Court Palace. And it flows through central London all the way down here to Essex and Kent, where the tidal extent finishes just beyond us in Shoebury-Ness and Sheerness in Kent across the water. And over the years, obviously, the Thames built the city, so to be an operational port, the river walls have been built to keep the sea out, and it's been dredged for navigation, creating a much deeper, faster flowing channel than it would have been naturally back in Roman times. There's just 2% of natural riverbank left on the whole of the tidal Thames. And that's that picture you can see in the top left-hand corner there. That's Syon Park in Richmond. And really, it's resulted in very, very, obviously, vertical walls, not very well vegetated. We've lost all of that intertidal habitat and salt marsh that would have been there, about 10,000 hectares over time. And it's very, very fast, so there's nothing for life to cling on to, if you like, and the wildlife that needs to migrate up and down the river has no refugia, has no areas to go to feed and to get away from predators or get out of pollution events. So really, we've had to innovate over time to build back that more naturalized habitat into the heavily built up environment, and doing that has had to create innovative ways to do it, building it as part of landside development and as part of flood defence. And with Thames Estuary TE2100, that's our flood defence blueprint for the next 100 years or next 90 years, because the first 10-year review is just coming to an end. And we're going to have some hard decisions to make. There's going to have to be raising of the flood defences in some places because there's just no room to set back, to create that naturalisation. But also we're going to have to find areas that we can renaturalise, that we can give back to the sea. So the TE2100 plan covers the entire tidal Thames, and it's really the first strategy of its kind that's looking to do that whole-scape approach, really take account at the tidal extents of the tributaries, as well as the freshwater input from the freshwater Thames and the tidal surges and oceanic influence from the ocean. So how have we gone about it in central London? Well, back in 2008, we project managed a new piece of guidance for developers called Estuary Edges. And this was the first time it was put into print what they'd been trying to do, the Environment Agency, the Port of London Authority, and local authorities over time, to try and build some of that biomimic through soft and hard engineering, those more natural intertidal habitats that you would find if we hadn't built across the land and seascape in this way. So back in 2008, the first guidance was launched, and that's really been the blueprint for developers moving forward. But a lot has changed in that time. So in 2017, the Environment Agency managed to find a bit more money to do an update to the guidance, but crucially, do the first consistent set of ecological surveys across the sites that we currently have within the network. Some studies had been done on these terrace systems before, but they'd been really, really opportunistic, master's or PhD focused, and had never really been brought into one place. So all of the advocacy that was done by the Environment Agency and others with developers to get these kinds of habitats built as part of riverside development had to come from expert knowledge. So for the first time, we've got baseline data sets, and I'll be coming on a little bit to that in a moment. So we currently have 17 sites across within the Greater London Authority area, and they differ in how they've been put together. So obviously it's not one solution fits all in every space. It's very dependent on the local dynamics, the bends in the river, how much sunlight, the gradient that you can achieve within that build, and the sediment type and the water quality within that area. So this is just an example, this is just a map to show the network across the GLA area. And the types of estuary edges that we can actually manage within that urbanised area are categorised into 3 types. So we have naturalised setback, which is essentially managed realignment light. It's an engineered version of managed realignment. Vegetated intertidal terraces, wall options, and absolutely no encroachment, if it can be at all. The policy is no encroachment, but if it's a nationally significant infrastructure project, then there is occasionally times when encroachment is allowed. But generally speaking, no more encroachment into the river because it's already constrained enough. Naturalised setback looks a bit like this. This is Barking Creek, which is, that's the Barking Creek Barrage, which is part of the Thames Barrier flood defence. So when the Thames Barrier closes, that barrage closes as well. And across the other side of the river, the Darrant Barrage closes too. So it completely cuts off central London from tidal surges coming upriver. So the naturalised setback, this is the most natural option you can achieve according to the guidance that we've developed. And there's not many places in the tidal Thames that you can achieve this. All of the sites, all of the naturalised setback sites are actually within Barking Creek. You take out the flood defence wall, you landscape and grade the area to be ideal for vegetation, natural vegetation and wildlife, but you can encourage that vegetation through planting. And this particular site is really accessible as well, so it's quite easy to monitor. It's one that's within our regular annual monitoring network. And you can see there a lovely bucket of fish. And basically, we've proved that now this is believed to be a significant bass nursery area, sea bass nursery area. And the theory is that this actually helps to feed the North Sea fish stocks. So it's just another piece of evidence to showcase how the Thames Estuary is a nursery area right now, but it could be even better if we could fit more habitat like this back into the urbanised edges. Intertidal vegetated terraces. This is where you require a little bit of space to set back into the land to create the terrace gradient and the terrace width. And really, it's trying to biomimic that continuum from the foreshore up across the terraces and into the abutting against the flood defences without those vertical edges. So you tend to have multiple elevations depending on the local conditions, and it has a deep fill and really good drainage. So this is a series of sites. There's about 6 sites around within the network that has these intertidal vegetated terraces. This one is at North Greenwich Peninsula by the Millennium Dome. You can see there in the background. This was built about 20 years ago. It was well before any of the guidance was put together, any of the expert opinion had been formed. And the negotiation with the developer, they actually agreed to set back by 10 metres, which was quite a big deal at the time. That was prime land that they were developing and giving back a huge amount all around the Greenwich Peninsula to build several sites back into it. But this isn't actually evidenced anywhere, but personal communications with one of the EA staff at the time, I've been told the developer said that they had a 15% increase in property prices from that terrace being built alone. So the aesthetic value, the social value of these sites is really something that needs to be built into those blended finance models whilst taking account of the other socio-economic issues around that. Finding that mechanism to really to help maintain the aesthetic value that's, that premium property is deriving, i.e. the river view, the habitat view. That needs to be accounted for within any kind of Section 106 money, I think, anyway. That's my theory. So, yes, there's 6 sites around the Thames Estuary, but this is mainly down in the more brackish marine area, so sort of West India Docks area and downwards, Deptford Creek downwards. And then the final option, the least natural but the best urban option, is what we're calling vertical beaches or wall options. So these are really window box style bolt-on timbers that you can put onto a wall, any wall that has sloping brick, concrete or sheet piles in front of it. And really they colonize really quickly. They look like vegetated, salt marshy type window boxes. It's quite hard to prove that the fish and the biodiversity do use it, but if you go out on a rigid inflatable, out on a little boat on a high tide, you can actually float there and watch the fish feeding within the wall box vegetation. So they're using it very much like they would a salt marsh, getting in there, getting in the back, and then coming out on the change of the tide. And we do fish surveys in this creek as part of education programs because it's an ideal place, nice, easy slipway, and an education centre right there as well. So doing seine netting within there can really prove what kind of fish are using that. And you'll find similar fish that you would within Barking Creek. So there's juvenile bass, there's eels, there's flounder, there's gobies, there's all sorts of things in there. So it's a very rich environment. And why are we doing this? Well, like I said, it's trying to get that vegetation back into a heavily urbanised area. But essentially, we want to create a string of pearls, a stepping stones of habitat, if you like, from the coastal marshes downstream in the marine end, all the way through central London as far as possible, linking in with the floodplain restoration and river restoration going on in the upstream extents of the tributaries. And we need to go a step further. We need to be linking this with our landward green infrastructure as well. So innovation around that is really key. And I'm going to show you a quick example of where that's actually been done, at least in a one way. This is a new development that's been built in the last 2 to 3 years in Royal Wharf. And if you don't know where Royal Wharf is, it's on the north bank of the river, and you can see the Thames barrier there in that lower picture, just towards the end. So it's just upstream on the north bank of the Thames barrier. And what they did here was they built an intertidal terrace as part of the development, but they also built a swale behind the back, which just looks like a park. And the water drains through the swale under the path, under the Thames path, and then through the flood defence, and unfortunately drains out under the terrace. If they'd built it in a way so that it drained into the terrace, you'd be getting that water dynamic, even a slight one, to counteract against the tide. So essentially what you're doing is building in a more nature-based solution to help cultivate more natural intertidal habitat within that terrace. So we're doing a lot of advocacy work around this at the moment to try and get that embedded in riverside strategies. And we don't want this to be done in isolation. We need a wholescape approach, and we need to be linking with those coastal marshes. So we're working with downstream partners to do a strategic regional mapping of coastal habitat restoration potential within the lower Thames and the outer Thames. And this is linking in with some Environment Agency work across a national strand called Restoring Meadows, Marsh and Reef, and championing coastal coordination, which I don't think I'm going to have time to get to. I think I'm going to go over time. And a new piece of EA work looking to build a sediment resource database. So that's really looking at where are your sinks and sources of sediment, and how can that sediment be used beneficially to create coastal habitats. And it's not just about the environment. We can be linking in with socioeconomic agendas on this, really utilising the need and the creation of these habitats to strengthen the skills base of local riverside communities. And they're not just environmental skills. You can learn a whole heap of transferable skills through working on projects like this and with organisations like us. So we're piloting a new integrated approach to education, trying to link riverside communities and train them in transferable skills they can take into any industry, but they're learning them through an environmental lens, so they're getting that really strong environmental message. and with an optional environmental option at the end, just in case anyone's interested in an environmental career, but doesn't want to go through the traditional higher education route. So how do they get that experience? How can they get those connections without having to do oodles of free volunteer work or higher education degrees? And I touched a bit on strategies before. This is a new initiative we're kicking off in January, but building on an old piece of work. The Thames Strategy East is one of 3 joint Thames strategies across the whole estuary. And this was the first time they really tried to do integrated planning guidance across the water. So taking account of the north and south bank, cross boundaries of local authorities and the water itself. But Thames Strategy East, for example, was published in 2008. It was a 100-year planning document, which it was quite strange to me. And it's never been refreshed. So with the onset of T2100, they're taking a riverside strategy approach for flood defence. So we're working with them, with councils up and down the tidal Thames to refresh those strategies and fill the gaps where there are no joint Thames strategies. So we'll get that whole estuary framework embedded. And the idea behind this is that we can get the intertidal, the riverside green infrastructure, all the multiple benefits you can get with flood defence embedded in local authority, local plans. So it makes it more of a driver, more of a statutory, not a statutory responsibility, but more of a formal responsibility and ownership over developing these nature-based solutions. I touched on Rememory. This is the national initiative to restore meadows, marsh and reef around the country. And we're working with the National Environment Agency team on this through the Coastal Partnership Network. And this is just one initiative that's really trying to, again, link those environmental enhancements into the socioeconomic legislation like the industrial strategy, levelling up agenda, all of those great things that's going to trigger green skills, higher employability, more jobs, better economies for local coastal communities. And another initiative that ended about a year ago was our first foray with the National Rivers Trust through the Coastal Partnerships Network, trying to look at how do we better support partnership working? How do we link catchment partnerships, which are working more upstream on the river catchments, on the freshwater reaches, with the coastal and estuary partnerships downstream? So we're trying to get that wholescape approach built in. So that brought about a lot of intelligence and a lot of networking, built relationships all around the country between those local partnerships. And those relationships are going from strength to strength. And then just recently, on a more national piece of work, we started working more closely with the Coastal Group Network. This is a mechanism for shoreline management plans, flood and coastal risk management that we have here in the UK. Big regional coastal groups set up, often embedded within local authorities and funded to do that strategic level work around our shoreline management plans. And we see this as a key mechanism to get that catchment management, that marine management, all of the great work that's going to lever in the nature-based solutions embedded in yet another form of strategy like the shoreline management plans. So how can we're working with them nationally and then cascading down and building relationships locally and regionally. So the map you can see on the far side just really highlights where all the catchment partnerships, the coastal and estuary partnerships and the coastal groups come together. There are gaps, but we're trying to fill that through a new national initiative we're working on right now to co-develop across sectors a national framework for coastal coordination. It's going to have a new name, don't worry. It's quite dry. But this is Environment Agency and DEFRA funded. It's a brilliant national collaborative. I really do enjoy working collaboratively. We spent 3 months at the beginning of this year basically making recommendations, discussing all the barriers to working in a more integrated, coordinated way, linking up across the land and sea more meaningfully, and what kind of infrastructure, what kind of resources do we all need in order to do this. And we came up with 6 high-level objectives, which really span across enabling that collaborative leadership at the top, enabling building the framework so that it can enable that coordinated delivery on the ground, really driving inclusive decision-making, so participative decision-making with local coastal communities who live and work there and have done for decades. So getting those voices in the room that don't traditionally engage with this kind of work. Streamlining communications. There's a huge amount of information out there for coastal messages, but they're all in different places. And unless you know what you're looking for, it's really hard to find. So building a coastal communications hub that's a one-stop shop for all things coastal messages, which includes our urban estuary. And building capacity, so building those skills, but also building capacity across sectors to understand each other better. So when I say nature-based solutions, and I'm talking about coastal habitat, it might not be, the person I'm talking to might be thinking nature-based solutions is something else. It's hard engineering, not soft engineering. And actually, it's somewhere in between. So leveling up that understanding across sectors so we understand each other better, providing better monitoring and evaluation, and then helping to shape and shift future policy, so that when we implement and when we try and coordinate on the ground, there's efficiencies that can be made so that we have that policy to back up what we're trying to do on the ground. So we've set up these mechanisms externally from the framework to pull together evidence, synthesize it in a way that it can be fed into an all-party parliamentary group and do that political, ministerial level influence, so we can push for better, more joined-up coastal policies in the future. So thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry I went over a little. And if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to try and answer them.
Thanks, Amy. That was really fascinating. I know we've got a few questions already coming in online, but we'll start with the room. If anyone in the room has a question, can you just put your hand up, and then Jean-Marie, and to wait for the microphone, Isaac is going to bring it to you.
Thank you for sharing all your insights about this very interesting initiative and program. What's your view on international collaboration on these kind of issues?
Oh, it's absolutely key, yes. We need to learn from each other. You know, there's processes and approaches going on all around the world. For example, the Estuary Edges guidance has gone as far afield as the Philippines, so they're actually using it over there in their river corridors. And with extra capacity, more resource through the national framework, we really want to see that international collaboration grow as well. Yes, the lady.
Yeah, Flavia.
Thank you, very interesting. I have a question about the last point that you mentioned, the new national framework for coastal collaboration. I suppose it's quite a big thing to set up such a national framework. What were the challenges that you faced in the process?
So it's still developing. So basically, we finished the round of recommendations, and we're just waiting to hear about the investment for the first phase of development. And I'd say the biggest challenges are essentially trying to do the collaboration online is quite tricky when you're doing those workshops, those kind of facilitated workshops. It's not as engaging as doing it in person. We also had a very short time scale, so the funding stream took a long time to open. And what should have been a 12-month project ended up being 3 months, just after Christmas. So it was a huge amount of work to pull together all the recommendations in time. But it was a massive collaborative effort across hundreds of organisations, from local to regional to national. And they really did. Everybody pulled out all the stops to create the evidence base for the recommendations. And then we all had to have rather a long lie down afterwards over Easter. So I'd say those were the biggest challenges, because everybody who came to the table knew that there needed to be better collaboration and they wanted this to happen. So even though there were disagreements, there wasn't always consensus on what was needed. The passion and the energy was there to collaborate and coordinate better. So we're sort of riding a wave, if you like, of momentum from all of these coastal and marine and catchment practitioners that just want to be able to do a better job faster, in recognition that, you know, we're running out of time. We have a climate resilience issue, and this is part of the puzzle to get there.
I know there was a question up front as well.
Thank you. From the Flemish government in Belgium, quite overwhelmed about your story. I have loads of questions, but I'll stick to two. The one practical, the planning guidance you mentioned, is that obligatory? Are they the local municipalities, are they free to use it or not?
Yes, they're free to use it. The Riverside strategies, the joint Thames strategies, they're not statutory, they're not mandatory in their own right, but they are embedded in the Mayor's London Plan, which is more of I think it is statutory guidance, but it's up to the local authorities individually how they implement it. So that's why organisations like us are so important for doing that advocacy on top of doing this strategic work, because it's day in, day out, advocating and communicating about the need for it, and that's part of the resource that we need moving forward. So we're trying to embed it in the system, in the planning system, so it gets done a bit easier.
Yeah. Okay, that was the point I was getting to, like
Yeah.
keeping on the tension, putting the tension to get
Yes.
it implemented in local plans. Okay, and then my second question goes a bit further on this. Resources about people collaborating. You need to have the people, so your local networks are growing bottom up, which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
How it's quite vulnerable as well.
Yes.
I think if you take somebody away, sometimes it just stops. How do you cope with that?
Yeah, that's one of the inherent main challenges actually in coastal and estuary partnerships, and that's something we're trying to change through. We're formalising the Coastal Partnership Network into a charitable incorporated organisation, and what we have an ambition to do is be able to provide almost like a career pathway for people that seem to have an affinity with this kind of work. 'Cause it's not for everybody, you know, having that a lateral thinking brain, being able to listen to lots of different agendas and join the dots across them is something you can learn, but I think there is a natural sort of, you know, ability around it as well. But because of that insecure funding, insecure funding landscape for coastal and estuary partnerships, because a lot of our real value is social capital, is knowledge capital, and retaining that's really hard when you don't have that kind of sustained finance. And this is really why, I mean, you heard from my colleague Heather Hilburn yesterday, we're really trying to drive forward on how do you evidence the return on investment for that social and knowledge capital? Because if you fund your social capital in that way, your natural capital will follow. But everybody always says that if there wasn't a Thames Estuary partnership, they'd want to set one up, but it's very hard to actually get the core funding through the door to support those core roles and retain that organisational memory. So yeah, we're trying to change that with pulling in resource and evidencing our value, basically.
Do we have any more questions in the room? Maybe we can go to some of the online questions, if Will can read them out.
Thank you. Just a reminder for everyone online that they can post questions in the chat or on Twitter, and Isaac and I will look at them and pass them on. I've got a couple here, one talking about biodiversity net gain legislation coming into force next year, and whether that provides opportunities or maybe challenges as well for estuarine, coastal, urbanised environments.
It definitely does provide opportunities, but at the moment, there's probably, in my opinion, there's too much wriggle room on the implementation of interventions like estuary edges, whereby you essentially enter into a negotiation between the developer and the Environment Agency, and you end up essentially getting what we would call the mandatory minimum. And it's that gap between the mandatory minimum and the sort of ecological gold standard that is the missing piece of the investment puzzle. So this is why those blended finance models are so important, to try and attract investment, to get each and every site to be the best that it can be, to give us the ecosystem services we need from those sites.
Thank you. And the last one I have here is, have you been able to do any research into people's opinions on these interventions?
We did a very, I'm going to call it quick and dirty survey back in the time when we updated the Estuary Edges guidance, which was in 2018. And we did surveys with passers-by right next to the sites, asking them a series of questions about the Thames, about what they thought about these sites. Did they think they were natural or unnatural? How did it make them feel? So we've got a snapshot of how people felt about them. And what was interesting was we asked, at the beginning of the survey, we asked what's the first word that comes into your mind when we say the Thames? And then we asked the same question after we'd gone through the survey, and there was a demonstrable shift from people being negative about the Thames estuary, it's dead and dirty because it's brown, and then through the survey, they basically understood a bit more about it, recognised those natural spaces, And most of the words at the end were positive, beautiful, protection, you know, enhancement, all of that kind of stuff. So that was really interesting. It's an area that I'd really like to grow within our organisation, is understanding that social connection, because I think we can use some of that intelligence to create better messaging, ones that actually, you know, really link with us as humans first, rather than crisis talk all of the time around, oh, you know, we're running out of time. There's always something we can do individually and collectively. So I think we could be cleverer about how we communicate, basically.
Brilliant. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Amy. So we run out of time for questions, but thank you so much for your answers.
You're welcome.
I'll be sharing Amy's contact details, just like the other speakers, with everyone who's attended the conference. So if you have any follow-up questions or ideas for collaboration, then you can get in touch.
Yes, please.
As an external speaker, I would also like to give you a little gift back from SARCC. So Isaac will bring one. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody.